On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
111 times. That's how many times Anthony Fauci refused to answer a question this week about the decisions that shut down the world. And the questions he refused to answer go a lot further than a virus. Because in 2020, the US created more money than in any year outside of a world war. By every rule of economics, prices should have exploded on contact, but they didn't. And the reason why might be the most uncomfortable question of the last 5 years. So why does this matter? Because of what's happening right now. The 30-year Treasury yield just hit its highest level since the summer of 2007. Elizabeth Warren went on record agreeing with Donald Trump that the debt ceiling should be abolished. And the man who built the 2008 bailout came out of a long silence to say we need an emergency plan ready for whatever comes next. There's a name for what comes next: the big print. So what was 2020 really hiding? And where do you put what you've earned when the last hiding place is already gone? This is Truth Block. I'm Hurley. Let's mine truth. Okay, quick favor before we get into it. Most of you watching are not subscribed, and that one tap is the best way to support the channel. All right, we appreciate you. Let's get into it. This week, two huge things happened. The one that made the front page was Anthony Fauci, under subpoena in front of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, saying the same sentence 111 times. And this is the part that makes it even more strange. Fauci already had a blanket pardon from Joe Biden covering everything up to the day it was signed. So the Fifth Amendment isn't protecting him from the past. It's protecting him from what he'd have to say about it now, under oath. Rand Paul is moving for a contempt vote next week. And while Fauci was declining to answer, the White House posted 2 words, the truth, and a link to covid.gov. The link takes you to a government page called Lab Leak, The True Origins of COVID-19, which names Fauci directly and says the paper used to discredit the lab leak theory was prompted by him. We're going to come back to the Fauci hearing a bit later, because what's actually in those diaries matters a lot more once you understand what was happening to the money at the same time. Which brings us to the second big story this week. Fed Chair Kevin Warsh held interest rates and told the country he didn't need to raise them, because the bond market had already done the job for him. Then he took credit for it. So the new Fed chair just told the most powerful market on earth that he's following it, not leading it, which would be fine except for what the market did next. Yesterday, the 30-year Treasury yield hit 5.2%, the highest since the summer of 2007. Long rates in this country have been falling in a straight channel since 1981. And this week, the whole thing broke. Then Senator Elizabeth Warren posted that the debt limit should be scrapped entirely, and it's one thing that she agrees with Trump on. That ceiling has already been lifted 80 times since 1970. So everyone already knew it was theater. But there's something different about the day both sides stop performing it out loud. So the man with the control says the market is driving. The market just went back to 2007, and Congress is getting ready to take the last speed limit off the car. So what does the bond market know? Larry Lepard runs a fund and wrote a book called The Big Print, and has been early on the Fed twice on this show. He sat down with Michelle McCrory on Sunday and got asked whether Warsh is really the hawk everyone thinks he is.
You can say that you don't believe in God, but then when you're in a foxhole and the shells start coming in, it's hard to be an atheist. And so he's going to flip. He has to flip mathematically. That's the whole point. It's another thing that everybody doesn't understand. This isn't all these players on the chessboard. They're all just talking mouthpieces. It's all like kind of a kabuki theater sort of thing. I mean, they really can't control what they have to do, and the circumstances are going to control it. And the circumstance that's bearing down on them is that the debt market is growing exponentially, and without growth, with equivalent growth in the money supply and inflation, they can't support it. And that's just a fact. And so at some point in time, I believe, and this I wrote the book, there will be a third big print. The first 2 were GFC and COVID. So it's coming.
The word doing the work here is circumstances. Lepard is saying it doesn't matter what Warsh believes because the chair doesn't hold the pen. And the number that proves it is this. Last year's deficit came in around $1.9 trillion, but the debt itself grew by $3.5 trillion over the same 12 months. Nobody voted on that difference. It just showed up on the tab. So the fair question is what happens when math like that finishes? And Ray Dalio built the largest hedge fund in the world by answering questions like that. He sat down with Stephen Bartlett on Diary of a CEO today, pulled out a chart, and started describing something much bigger than a recession.
Then you have this big cycle, which is typically lasts for about a lifetime on average, about 80 years. We went through that last time, 1945. there are orders. There's a monetary order, there's a domestic political order, there's a geopolitical order. Okay. You have the bubble bursting. Okay. You have this. This is what we're talking about, that dive. And then when you go through that, you break down these orders. And when they break down, then you would get rid of the debt burden. So you get rid of the monetary system as you're used to it. You may get rid of the domestic order. Many countries' orders, their systems end. I mean, they all end at some point. And so they can break down quite often in a time of great internal conflict. Does the system last? And that happens at that time.
You get rid of the debt burden by getting rid of the monetary system, not reforming it, not restructuring it. The system itself is the thing that gets retired. And notice there's no alarm in his voice at all. He's describing it the way you describe a tide going out. These big debt cycles run in roughly 80-year intervals. And the last reset, as Dalio pointed out, was 1945. Do that math out loud and it puts us to right now. Which means everything since 2008 hasn't been a series of separate emergencies. It's been one long, very expensive effort to keep a cycle from ending. And there have been two of them. You lived through both. Let's start with 2008. Those losses were real and nobody ever absorbed them. They got moved onto the Fed's balance sheet and paid off with 15 years of rates near zero. The president of El Salvador said it in one line this week on X. We never escaped the 2008 financial crisis. We just shifted the pain. And Jeff Park found the receipt. July of 2007 was the month Bear Stearns liquidated its subprime books, which is where the whole thing started. And this week, the 30-year went right back to that level. 19 years and we're right back at the starting line again. Then in March of 2020, everything stopped. Over the next 9 months, the Fed added roughly $3.3 trillion to its balance sheet. And once you count the emergency facilities and backstops, the number people use is closer to $6 trillion. The money supply grew more than 25% in a single year, which has never happened in this country outside of a world war. Now, normally that ends exactly one way. Prices explode. We should have seen hyperinflation after that much money printing, but we didn't. Why? Well, money can only cause inflation when it moves. Economists call that velocity, and all it means is how many times a dollar changes hands. Your paycheck goes to the grocery store, the store pays its supplier, the supplier pays the trucker buys fuel. $1, 4 transactions, and that circulation is what turns printed money into higher prices. And in 2020, the economy was switched off by decree. Velocity fell to the lowest level ever recorded, because you can't print $6 trillion into an economy that's running, but you can print it into one that's frozen. Now, there's a well-circulated theory that this was the entire point, that the shutdowns were designed to crush velocity so the bailout could go through without setting off hyperinflation. That's a theory, but you don't need proof of intent to see the outcome, because whether killing velocity was the goal or the side effect, it's the only reason 2020 didn't detonate the global economy. And Luke Roman, who's about as far from a conspiracy account as you can get, put the uncomfortable version on the record this week. He pointed out that Fauci oversaw the funding of a virus that primarily killed old and sick people right as Western entitlement programs started seriously threatening the solvency of Western bond markets. That's some coincidence. So let me say plainly here where I sit, because I'm not going to pretend I'm neutral on this. I think we were lied to about COVID, about where it came from, and about what was done to us in response. And that's not a fringe position anymore. And Rand Paul's claims make the case better than I can. His claim is that Fauci privately knew the lab leak was credible in the first few weeks, then spent 2 years telling the country the opposite and calling anyone who disagreed a conspiracy theorist. But look at what that story actually covers. It's about where the virus came from. It says nothing about what was done to us afterward, and those are two separate questions. One of them is close to settled now. The other has barely been asked. Because if a man will mislead an entire country about the origin of a pandemic, the fair question is what else got decided for reasons we were never given. And the biggest decision anyone made in 2020 was shutting the world economy down. What I can't tell you is why. Nobody can, because the man who would know pleaded the fifth 111 times on Wednesday. But the why was never the part they controlled. The money data has been public on the Fed's own website for 6 years, while this country argued about masks. They can decline the question, but they can't decline the math. And the math says the bailout landed in 2020 and the bill landed in 2022, addressed to everybody who works for a living. Money supply went up 396% since the year 2000. Reported prices up 96%. Groceries up 33%. And this is how a lot of people ended up selling something they own just to cover a bill they had no part in creating. And that's the exact trap Ledn was built to get you out of. With Ledn, instead of selling your Bitcoin, you borrow dollars against it. Up to 50% of your stack's value funded in under 6 hours, with no credit checks, no capital gains event, at around half the rate of a credit card. With Ledn, your Bitcoin stays yours, and so does everything it does from here. So head to learn.ledn.io/simply to learn more. So that's 2 prints, and both worked in the narrow sense that the system is still standing, which is why this week matters, because the man who built the first one came out of a long silence a few months ago to talk about the next one. Hank Paulson was Treasury Secretary in 2008.
This crisis is different, right? When you hit the wall and you're trying to issue treasuries and the Fed is the only buyer and the prices of the treasuries are going down and interest rates are up, that's a dangerous thing. And so the thing I am talking about now is we know, people say, when are you going to hit the wall? I obviously don't know. It's impossible to know. But the law of economic gravity, you're not going to know that. So, and when we hit it, it will be vicious. So we have to prepare for that eventuality. And I think we need an emergency break the glass plan, which is targeted and short-term on the shelf, so it's ready to go when we hit the wall.
There may come a day when the United States tries to sell its debt and the Federal Reserve is the only buyer left in the room. The government issues the bond, the government buys the bond, and the money used to buy it gets created on the spot. And people don't write emergency plans for things they think aren't going to happen. Which brings us to the part that decides whether any of this ever touches you personally. Later in that same conversation, Bartlett asked Dalio what the UK is a cautionary tale of. And Dalio walks through the endgame of an over-indebted country step by step.
It's just logical, right? It's just when you're heavily indebted and you're not as productive and you've got large wealth gaps, what are you going to do? It's politics. You're going to say, I can't raise taxes because if I raise taxes, besides having great conflict, people are going to leave. Okay. So I can't cut benefits because those who are receiving whatever those benefits are the ones that are suffering them. And what am I going to do? Cut those benefits? So now, okay, but wait a second, I'm running a big deficit or I don't have enough money. So where does the money come from? How do I get out of not getting more in debt? And then what does that mean for the person who's lending to you? They don't want to lend to you, right? So you're not going to get the money to finance the deficits. It's mechanics.
So what is it they have to do to get out of that situation?
They're going to have a major restructuring. You're going to have to
go bankrupt.
Write down. Yeah, well, the way the central banks work now is they do a mixture of printing money, which produces inflation, and then restructuring the debt in some way, like maybe changing the maturity. And in these cycles, quite often they put in capital controls because they think people are leaving, so they don't want them to leave and take their money with them. So they put in capital controls that says you can't leave with your money, okay, and they'll have exit taxes. And that's the type of thing that happens until, there's a period of great turbulence. Then you, through a combination of restructuring the debt means, like, quite often you lengthen the maturity of the debt.
Print money, restructure the maturities on debt you already sold to people, bring in capital controls, add exit taxes so nobody can leave with what they've got. And all of it needs the same thing to work, which is somebody standing in between you and what you own. A bank that can be instructed, a border that can be closed, a ledger somebody else administers on your behalf. That's the layer, and it's been sitting there your whole life. Invisible right up until the day somebody decides to use it. So what kind of money has no layer like this? Bitcoin. There's no velocity to switch off because Bitcoin supply doesn't care how fast it moves or whether it moves at all. There's no ceiling to raise because 21 million was never a policy decision. There's no ruler to swap because the ledger is the ruler. And there's no committee that can decline to answer because none of it was ever a decision in the first place. But you have to be careful here because there's a version of Bitcoin that solves none of this. If you hold an ETF, what you own is a claim on Bitcoin that a large firm holds on your behalf. And every tool Dalio just described works perfectly well against a line in somebody's database. A capital control doesn't care whether the thing is stopping in a stock, a bond, or a Bitcoin ETF. It only cares that there's an address it can send the instruction to. Real Bitcoin, where you hold the keys, has nobody to send that instruction to. That's the whole difference. And when Dalio's moment arrives, it's the only difference that will matter. Which is exactly why this show is sponsored by Bitkey. The threat was never really the exchange going under, it's the one backup that ends up in the wrong box during a move. And the question nobody wants to sit with, which is what happens to your stack if something happens to you? Bitkey has no seed phrase to lose, and the new device has a screen so you see exactly what you're approving before you approve it. And recovery and inheritance are built right in from the beginning with no subscription. Bitkey is hands down the best Bitcoin wallet on the market for ease of use, rock-solid security, and peace of mind. So head to bitkey.world/truth and use the promo code TRUTH to get 10% off the new Bitkey. And holding through what's coming is a position you carry for a decade, which means your setup has to survive it. If your coins are on an exchange, or you built a self-custody plan back in 2021 and haven't touched it since, that gap is what the Bitcoin Way closes. The Bitcoin Way offers one-on-one white-glove help from real human Bitcoin experts on anything from self-custody, hardware, node setup, to inheritance planning and locking down your security. No question is too basic for the Bitcoin Way. And the first 30-minute consultation is completely free when you visit thebitcoinway.com/Hurley. So both of the first two prints needed something to absorb the shock. In 2008, it was the rest of the world's willingness to keep buying American debt for almost no interest. And they did it for 15 years straight. In 2020, it was the frozen economy where the new money physically couldn't circulate. Neither of those was luck, and each one only worked this one time. So look at what's left for the third. The bond market just went back to 2007, which tells you the appetite that soaked up the first one is gone. And you can't shut the world down twice, because whatever you believe about 2020, everybody now knows what's on the other side of that door. The third print arrives with nothing to hide behind. That's the actual news this week. Not the yield, not the hearing, but the absence of a shock absorber. Jeff Ross made his triumphant return back to X, and he said it better than I can. He said we're at the almost incomprehensible intersection of a fourth turning climax and a once-in-500-year shift in what an individual can actually hold and control. And those two things arriving together is no coincidence. Thank God the old order is breaking down at the exact moment a replacement is already here. Which is why the separation of money and state is the most important fight of this age. For 5,000 years, whoever controlled the money controlled everything downstream of it. Who gets bailed out and who gets liquidated. Which war gets fought and for how long. Whose savings quietly pay for the mistake. Every lie we talked about today, every refusal to answer, every ceiling raised in the dark, only works because the money runs through somebody else's hands before it ever reaches yours. And here's what makes this fight different from every other fight over power in human history. You don't have to win an election. You don't have to convince a single person who doesn't want to be convinced. You don't have to burn everything down. You opt out, one person at a time, by holding money nobody can print, on a ledger nobody can edit, with keys nobody else has a copy of. That's the entire thing. And it's the most peaceful transfer of power ever built. So if you found this video because of Fauci, I'm glad you did. And I want to leave you with one thing. The corruption you're angry about is not a personal problem. You can put every one of them in front of a committee and every one of them will take the fifth. What you can actually do is stop holding the thing that they can print. Bitcoin's time is close, and the people who see that first are the ones who get to decide what comes next. All right, now I want to hear from you. Do you think the 2020 shutdowns were a public health decision that had monetary consequences, or a monetary decision wearing a lab coat? I told you where I land, so I want to hear where you do. And if the third big print really is coming with nothing left to hide behind, where is your savings sitting right now? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if this one gave you signal, hit like and send it to somebody who still thinks 2020 was about a virus. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.